Hi, my name is Brenda Titus. I'm a professional hypnotist in Orange County, California. For information about myself and my program, including in-person sessions, please go to my website, ochypnotherapy.com. Today we are continuing our Thoughts from the Hypnosis Office series on fear. And I wanted to talk about kind of a particular series of fears that I work with because they all kind of have similar roots. So today we're going to talk about fear of flying, driving, confined spaces, and crowds. And largely just because as I work with a lot of root cause types of issues when it comes to fear, I've kind of found some similarities with these particular fears. And you might actually kind of notice, that they make sense with some other fears as well. So the first big theme that we need to address when we're talking about, fear of flying or driving, confined spaces or crowds, or even a few other types of fears, is the possibility of actual physical danger. Now, obviously, by the time somebody is coming to see me, it's gotten to be over exaggerated, the idea of the possibility of actual physical danger. So, obviously we're going to do a reality check around, the potential for physical danger. And then also, also recognize, that our protective parts of ourselves are trying to keep us safe, and recognizing, that we want to, recognize the danger, recognize the possibility, the potential. And, sometimes that is a really big part of what we do. Now, sometimes there is a deeper rooted element around fear in general. And so that is something that we're going to address throughout our sessions. So, like I said, the first big pot of what we want to address is the potential for actual physical danger. Now, the reality is that is the least common reason that people come to see me, ultimately for their fear of flying or driving. Now, sometimes, obviously, but that is more likely as I'm doing the kind of work that I'm doing with people. We're going to head in a couple of the next directions. So the next one that I wanted to talk about has to do with how we might feel about other people. And so, sometimes people will come to me and they'll say, well, I have a fear of flying. And really, as we're doing our work, what it is that they don't like to be so on top of everybody else, in the middle of the cabin of the airplane. And so we might need to address that. Sometimes people who, when I'm dealing with fear of driving, and it's not so much that people are afraid of driving or driving on the freeway, especially, it's the potential of what other people are doing out there on the freeway. The other people that aren't cautious. Maybe my client is cautious, but, they're so frustrated to see everybody else that isn't cautious or careful out there. Or now this is another part of too many people, too much traffic. And so unfortunately then sometimes that anxiety around driving has become, that the person has, starts ruminating as they're sitting in traffic, or they feel stressed because they're running late because of the traffic. And then that has built up the anxiety or the fear around driving. And obviously, issues like crowds, or even being in a confined space with, whether with other people or not, even, things like crowds. Again, if people aren't, behaving, or, people are being obnoxious or loud. Actually, I have a lot of people who, especially with crowds, they're very sensitive to energy and sensitive to the noise, and, really just, being aware of, all the energy going on around them and all of that. And so, so sometimes, like I said, that's another kind of root that we have to deal with as we're dealing, especially with things like flying, driving, crowds, confined spaces, those kinds of things. So sometimes possibility of actual physical danger. And then next, sometimes the way that we might feel about the other people associated with those things. So next I have to get to pretty much the most common issue that I'm ultimately dealing with people who have a fear of flying or driving, or maybe some crowds or confined spaces, and it has to do with control issues. I'm sorry. Now, sometimes we already know that this has manifested in other parts of their lives. So somebody, might come to me and say, well, I need help, dealing with flying or driving or some such. And we realize that, maybe they have other, elements around control, feeling like, somebody else is driving the plane, somebody else is in charge. I don't feel like I'm in control of my body or how it feels when I'm nervous or scared. And a lot of times that really is heavily rooted in some elements around childhood. So, when, people who maybe grew up in a household where they were walking on eggshells, they didn't feel necessarily so safe and secure growing up in their home, whether that's, a misperception of being safe and secure, or actual concept around walking on eggshells and not feeling and not being as safe in how they were raised. So so that is a really common issue that I deal with flying and driving, is that those control issues. Now there is also the idea of, both giving up control and also an interesting side effect, which is that they might feel afraid of how they feel when they feel out of control. And so then that becomes, really kind of more where they're dealing with the physiology, maybe even panic attack element of when they feel out of control, that they don't want to feel that way in a confined space like a car, in traffic, or in a crowd, or in an airplane. And so that's really where those control issues really come in. And so very often as we're talking about, the fear, and they'll say, well, yeah, it's not about the possibility of the plane going down, then they kind of say, well, then I won't, that's not my fear, right? But it's the fear of the fear. It's the fear of the feeling of being out of control. And that so often is really what they're dealing with, is that they don't want to feel that uncomfortable feeling of being out of control or of being scared. And especially in a space like being in traffic, or being in a car, being in an airplane, or being in a crowd where they have less control over the situation on top of it. So and the additional side note to that is that they get very afraid of what if in the midst of me feeling out of control, that I do something or I say something and everybody sees how out of control I feel. And I literally asked a client one day, I said, what are you afraid you're going to like go screaming out of the airplane as they're about to shut the door? And he said, yep, that's my fear. And I said, oh, okay. And that's a reality where it's that, that feeling of being out of control. And then what's going to happen, and, how much trouble am I going to be in if everybody sees how afraid or uncomfortable I am. So those are the primary issues that I tend to see. Now, of course, every client is different. And what we're doing is kind of digging into the soil, the roots of, why people have the particular fears that they have. And so obviously there are variations on all of these things. I have experienced people who really, it's the flying has become this deep sadness tied to, saying goodbye to the people that they were visiting, or, unfortunately, sometimes, they were on vacation and they were so happy being on vacation, and now they have to say goodbye and go back to their normal everyday life. And so sometimes that discomfort can be tied to even sadness. Sometimes I will work with somebody who truly has experienced something very scary in their life, whether it was, a really serious or not so serious car accident, or, actually once I worked with a woman, and, we were dealing with a fear of flying. And I mean, somebody else had a medical emergency on the plane, but it left her, very fearful of being in that situation again. And so, so we have things like that. Sometimes people who have experienced, the incredible discomfort around turbulence, actually, turbulence, even though it technically isn't an actual safety issue, but that definitely hits a lot of people's discomforts. And so that can actually really play into then how that fear hits them, because they do not want to feel the discomfort around that. Or even, like I said, with other people and the behavior of other people, that might, add to some of the fears or anxieties associated with that. So I thought that would be kind of a fun way to introduce some ideas around fear and where they come from, and know that, if you have, control issues, or you have, feelings about, the other people, or different things like that ring true to you. I hope that this was helpful, and you kind of, being able to think about, how you might feel about flying or driving, or some of the other common fears that I talked about today. And so I hope that maybe that was able to help you unwind, or start thinking about how you might overcome some of those fears or anxieties. And I hope that you enjoyed today's episode, and I will be back for a little bit more on fear as I continue my fear series next week. And in the meantime, have a wonderful week.